Welcome back to another episode of the Resilient Revival podcast. This episode focuses more on the costs and benefits of revitalizing or refurbishing the buildings, and it also talks about how the collaboration of different stakeholders contributes towards refurbishing the buildings, and also who are the stakeholders, the main stakeholders that are involved in revitalizing or refurbishing the buildings, the abandoned buildings. Joining us today is Klug, who's a lecturer at Wits University, and he's supervising me for my research. He's registered with SACPLAN as a professional planner. Thank you so much, Neil, for joining me for this episode. Looking forward to hearing your opinions and insights to this topic. So my first question to you is, how can planners collaborate with different other stakeholders in producing or in coming up with innovations that help address the abandoned buildings?
As you've probably determined, it's complex. The area of abandoned buildings is complex, but something has to be done. And it will obviously require collaboration with stakeholders. So let's begin with, I think, the policymakers and the architects. Planners themselves can be policymakers. But what you have to address is tenure issues. I think as a start is, what is the status of the occupiers in terms of security of tenure? So in terms of policy, people need to secure their tenure. I think policymakers need to secure their tenure, and what it may require is providing alternative accommodation for the period that the buildings are upgraded to the point that they can live in the buildings. But obviously there are many different options.
Oh, thank you for that. And my second question is, what are the costs and benefits of refurbishing buildings or revitalizing buildings, particularly when focusing on, or when you have the mind of changing them into addressing the housing backlog? So this also speaks to the article which I read, which is about Hanan Mashaba, who wanted to use abandoned buildings, to expropriate the abandoned buildings, sell them off to the investors or to the property developers to refurbish them, and with the mind of addressing the housing backlog, providing affordable housing that is going to help reduce the crisis of housing or
into assets, the use of abandoned buildings to address the housing backlog. Now, you see, as an immediate idea, it seems perfect. So the key issue of tenure. Who owns it? Where is the owner? So let's for argument's sake say the city expropriated. Why would they expropriate it? Because the owner's disappeared, because the owner probably owes the city hundreds of thousands of rand in rates that haven't been paid. So they owe the city, so the city says, okay, in lieu of that money you owe us, we take the building. But now the city inherits a building that is full of people. It is unsafe, speaking to your thesis. It's very unsafe. And now they're the owners. What are they going to do? How much does it cost to refurb a building? So if it's more than 10 stories, if it's more than 5 stories, you've got to lift shafts, you've got to maintain. Huge amounts of money. You've got to maintain the lift. You've got to pump water to the top so that so you've got pumps, huge pumps to pump water up. You've got toilets. You've got to get the sewage system to flow down and out. There's electricity systems. Many of these buildings are built in the 1970s, so they're now already 50 years old. They don't have Wi-Fi. They don't have anything like that. So now you've got to refurb. So do you demolish the building and rebuild a new building? Or what do you do? So the second issue is state of building. You've got to determine, is the building fundamentally unsafe? Are there cracks in the foundations? Is it unsafe? Does it have to be actually demolished? And again, if it's a 5-10 story building, that cost alone means it's an implosion, a specialized implosion. In Joburg, there's only been about 3 buildings that have been imploded. 3 or 4 buildings, it's a very expensive. So they've got to place the explosives in a very specialized area that the building folds in and doesn't fall over onto other buildings. So state of building. So you need specialist engineers to come in and assess the building to say, is it structurally sound? Then you've got to look at the costs. Okay, let's say it's structurally sound. Right, now how are you going to refurb it? How much refurbing are you going to do? Are you just going to paint it? Are you going to replace all the sewage pipes, all the electricity cabling, all the water pipes? Do you have to replace it? Are they rusted? Are they leaking? So capital cost. There's a capital cost involved. Somehow somebody's got to pay upfront to refurbish the building. Then, equally important, more important, is the operational costs. Now you've got to manage the building. You've got to keep on making sure that every month money is coming in to pay for the maintenance of the lift, of the water systems, all of that. Yeah. So those are 2 components of cost, capital and operational. And then, of course, management. Management costs money. To manage it costs money. Somebody's got to. So I had a flat in a small little building, 3 stories. And there it's cheaper because there were no lifts, just a walk, just stairs going up. But you needed a body corporate of elected people living there, and they meet once a month. They meet and they discuss, has everybody paid their levy in the month? How much is sitting in the bank in case of emergencies? If there's a leakage in the roof, can we repair it? So it's that management. So these are all the components. So when you're asking the question, how can the rehabilitation of abandoned buildings be used to provide affordable housing options in gentrifying neighborhoods? You've got to consider all of these things. And I personally think they can be used for low-cost housing. But it needs, you need clever engineers, architects, to go in there and say, how do we refurb at minimal cost but safe? That's why your piece of research is very important, because it just looks at the safety elements. What is the basic safety element you would need in a 10-story building? What is the basics for cost purposes to keep the costs down and to keep the management costs down? So it needs a combination of an engineer, architect, clever architect, to say, okay, how do we refurbish this building in a way that's easily manageable? And so it's not going to have fancy, maybe you're not going to have a lift. Maybe you're going to actually have to walk 10 stories or 12 stories up and down, because you can't afford to refurbish the lift. Then you've got to say, okay, we've got to seal all the lift shafts. You've got to seal them. You can't have kids falling down there. You can't have people throwing garbage down the lift shaft. All of these things you've got to think about in the management. How people are going to behave. How do you manage that? So the way I see it is that these abandoned buildings are vertical informal settlements. They're vertical informal settlements.
Currently,
yeah. So how do you upgrade them like an informal settlement at minimal cost, involving the community? So it's a whole new area of thinking, which they're just not doing. They're just avoiding it. So they think they can come in there. And the previous mayor, Mashaba, did the same thing. He identified 76 buildings, and he said, we're going to go in there, we're going to sell them off 1 rand, 2 rand to the private sector, and then the private sector will come in and refurbish, and we'll have these lovely buildings. Well, nothing came of that project, because there are existing people there, and there is a constitution saying you cannot arbitrarily evict people out of buildings. So you have to deal with that tenure issue. And then, an added problem after all of that. Let's say, for argument's sake, you've got a private developer comes in and gentrifies. Either they're going to now relocate all those people and they have to be accommodated somewhere else. But let's for argument's sake, that you manage to find a system where you keep the poor people in the block and you refurbish it. What stops somebody, wealthy person, now saying, oh, now that looks attractive, I can make lots of money, and I'm going to come in there and offer them all some money and take over the block. So that's what you call down raiding. It happens with housing developments being B&G housing, well-located areas. You could have a very wealthy developer comes in and says, 10,000, 10,000, 10,000, 10,000, cash,
So are they
buys their houses.
Are they giving the people occupying the buildings or the owners of the building that time? Those wealthy people?
Well, it depends how it's then upgraded, you see. So if, let's say the city, or let's say a private developer upgrades it and gives everybody tenure, that's a possibility. There could be down raiding, that people could come in and buy them. So those are the kinds of things that happen, and I've put here, you've read Mallach, but read Lease, Slater, Wyly, Gentrification. Okay, there's a whole lot of books on gentrification. And it's a very complicated field.
Thank you so much, Neil. I will definitely drop the references for those 2 books you just suggested for my listeners to look on. So thank you so much for joining us, and thank you everyone for listening to today's episode. And this is a wrap because this is my last episode. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed.